The Canberra Chess Club Club Championship of 2023. Round 5. A perfect fifth. It's been a week since my reckless round 4, in which I set aside the time to play the championship, but didn't actually engage my mind fully with what I was doing. A round in which I suffered a second consecutive loss, and with it, completely spoiled any chance of winning this year's tournament. I entered this round with a new commitment in mind, that I should play with my whole heart, mind, body, and soul, or not play at all. With a newfound respect for that opportunity to sit and play a game of chess, I put my whole mind, heart, body, and soul into this game, in which I played with the black pieces against an opponent who opened with c4, the English. I played e5, and after knight c3, knight f6 and e4, this typical English position where white has a weakened backwards d-pawn and a hole on d4 that can be used by my b8 knight in future, but in return black has a clamp on the d5 square which his own knight can use. I played knight c6. On knight ge2, which struck me as an odd way of developing the knight, I had my first prolonged thought process of the game. Firstly, I found it odd because the knight blocks in the light-squared bishop. The only available square for the knight is g3, unless it wants to go back to where it started. And the only other idea it has is to support the pawn push d4, or maybe in the future f4. In any of those cases, I would like to play bishop c5. Bishop c5 prevents the d4 pawn push, thereby ensuring that his backwards pawn is unable to be traded off the board, and instead remains as a long-term weakness. It also gets me closer to castling, and it means that if I play d6 in the future, my dark-squared bishop will be outside of the pawn chain. I just had to consider that if he attacks my undefended bishop on c5, I'd have ways to keep it safe and effective. I saw that if knight a4, I could take on e4, simultaneously defending my bishop and attacking the f2 square. I also saw that with bishop c5, there might be some future in which a bishop sacrifice on f2 could make sense. It doesn't work just yet, but just to illustrate the kind of attack I'm envisioning, let's say, for illustrative purposes, b4, then bishop f2 check, followed by the knight and the queen storming the king's position rapidly. This could be dangerous in the future, and with that, I realized bishop c5 was good, and I played it. And he responded with h3, a slow move in that it does not develop his pieces or control the center, but it does deal with ideas associated with that bishop takes f2 check sacrifice, because now my knight can no longer jump out of the way of my queen and give a safe check. But nonetheless, despite dealing with that idea, it didn't control the center, and it didn't develop a piece. So I was quite okay and felt like I was doing well. I simply castled in response and put the ball back in his court. His answer was a3, another slow move on the other side of the board that did not control the center, nor develop any piece. It did, however, come with the obvious threat to play b4, attacking my bishop, so I needed to make sure I would be okay after b4. I thought about a5, which prevents b4 altogether. I didn't like it though because it weakens b5 and gives his knight another strong outpost in my position in addition to the d5 option. So I played instead a6, allowing b4, which he played, but creating a hidey hole on a7, which I used, knowing that if he continued with b5, apparently shutting out my bishop from the game, I would respond with d6, opening my light-squared bishop, challenging his b5 pawn, and leading to an opening of the position at a time in which I'm clearly better developed than he. I also saw that after bishop a7 he could play b5, attacking my knight, but that I could then take and he'd have to take back with his pawn, otherwise he'd lose the e4 pawn. And once he took back with the pawn, I'd have knight d4, and I would be completely fine. Now, those variations were not played though. After bishop a7, he played d3, opening a route for his dark-squared bishop. Here I played h6, because I was afraid that if I played something else, say d6, that he could pin my knight, and that if I followed up with h6, he could move back and maintain the pin and further defend the f2 square. But look at this, and look more. Look deeply into this position. Can you see what I missed in my imagination? There is a move that deals with the pin, wins a pawn, threatens the bishop. It is knight takes e4. An absolutely beautiful move that works because if bishop takes queen, then bishop takes f2 is not only check, but checkmate. I had to show that variation even though it wasn't played, because it is a beautiful idea, and would have justified the immediate d6, but nevertheless h6 was objectively just as good, although the optics were less spectacular. After h6, he has to come up with a move. He no longer has the option of bishop g5. If he plays bishop e3, I can take, which doubles his pawns on the e-file and opens the f-file towards his king, an outcome I'd be happy with. So what does he do? Well, he ended up playing a very strange looking move, but also very strong, according to the computer, g3. It's weird because it's yet another pawn move, not developing his pieces, not controlling the center, and in fact, creating further weaknesses around his kingside. I'm now already thinking about landing a knight on f3, which is no longer covered by a pawn. In fact, I can threaten knight f3 by playing knight d4 right now. If he's careless and plays something like bishop e3, he would run into knight f3, checkmate. If he takes my knight and I take back, his knight will be pinned to his rook, and I'll be able to continue developing with d6 and or c6 and so on, and his king side and his queen side are both forever weakened. So I played knight d4, and he responded with bishop g2, defending against the mate threat, and developing a piece, and preparing to castle. I responded with the natural d6, solidifying my pawns, opening my light-squared bishop, and expecting him to castle, but instead he took my knight, which I took back, now pinning his knight to his rook, as mentioned earlier. Now he cannot castle, because his knight is attacked and it's not defended. So I expected bishop b2 to break the pin, but he instead went bishop d2, meaning the knight could still not move. I realized that his king is in the center, his pawns are all over the shop, meaning there are weaknesses and holes in his position, and his bishop is passive. His knight is practically immobile. So this position favors me, and if I can open the position quickly, it should start to benefit me more and more as time goes on. The move I wanted to play here to achieve this opening of the position was f5. If f5 could be played, then the f-file might become open, strengthening my rook by giving it more scope, and making it work in tandem with my dark-squared bishop, adding pressure to f2. The obvious obstruction is the knight on f6, so I started looking for a better place for my knight. Knight d7 blocks my bishop. Knight e8 only gives me access to the f6 square, but knight h7 gives me access to the f6 and g5 squares, and hence of the three I went to h7, and now he castled. His king is no longer in the center, but his knight is still pinned. His f2 pawn is pinned as well. And f5 still strengthens my rook and potentially my light-squared bishop, and although it weakens the light squared diagonal leading to my king, there's no way for him to take advantage of that at the moment. So I played, as intended, f5 here, and he played, well, if he played e takes f5, I had envisioned playing bishop takes f5, and saw that he could respond with bishop takes b7. In this case I had planned on bishop takes h3, then if bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop with a threat of a mate on g2, and a secondary threat to the rook on f8, as well as lots of pressure on f2, and I thought this would be fine for me. So instead of taking on f5, he played the move rook c1, getting out of the pin and enabling his knight to once again have true mobility. I thought this was a good move because now the burden was on me again to come up with a move, and I found that to be a hard thing to do in this position, and these are the reasons why. Firstly, although I could just play c6 to take d5 and b5 away from his knight, in doing so I would weaken d6 and b6 forevermore, and I'm not sure I would want to do that. I could play f4, but after pawn takes pawn, the file has been shut down, and my bishop on d4 has lost its defenders. Incidentally, this is the computer's favourite way to proceed. I could play knight f6, but that blocks my rook, and the knight doesn't really have any great options after that. I could play queen e1, trying to swing my queen over to g6 potentially, but this allows knight d5, hitting the c7 pawn and tying my queen down to its defense. I could play bishop e6 to be ready to capture the knight if it ever lands on d5, but after bishop e6, he can take on f5, and now I either have to take with my rook, which is awkward and just loses because of bishop takes b7, or I take with my bishop and he gets to play knight d5 anyway. The point is, it's not easy for me here, and my clock is ticking away. Now at this point I still had 25 minutes left on my clock. I ended up playing a move that did not create any pawn weaknesses, a move that was not completely committal, a flexible move that would throw the ball back at my counterpart. I noticed that my dark squared bishop, nice as it was, could easily become the target of his knight if he played knight e2. So I decided to play in a flexible way that would also give me the option to face this eventuality in a favourable manner. I played knight g5. Now if he plays knight e2, then at the very least I can play knight e6 and defend my bishop. I'm not sure that I would do that, or if I would just retreat my bishop, but then again, I'm not even sure if he's going to play knight e2, and that's my whole point. I played knight g5 because it was reasonable and flexible, and it didn't give him any obvious targets or weaknesses to aim at. A final point behind this move is that it prepared f4, because now f4 would uncover an attack against his g3 pawn, thanks to my knight combining with my light squared bishop. I think it was due to this potential pressure on his g3 pawn that my opponent now played king h2, defending the g3 pawn, and also getting out of the pin against the f2 pawn. At this point, though my time was starting to get low, approaching 20 minutes, I sensed that it was a critical juncture in the game. I realized that his king was in a fairly open position, and that my pieces were well placed to start attacking him. If not now, then very soon. I also realized that if I was going to carry out an attack on the king side, I would want to ensure that the center remained closed, so that he could not create counterplay through the center. Therefore, I started to consider f4. It's true that he can take, but once I take back, material is equal, and I have immediate pressure against g3. In fact, I could take g3 here because when he recaptures, my queen swoops in, pinning and winning his bishop. I didn't see the whole of this variation in the game, but the variation I did see was f4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes h3 immediately, followed by queen h4, But I realised this would fail because his queen can join the defence at f3. But I did also see, nevertheless, that after f4 pawn takes pawn, at least the trade of pawns is equal, and it's definitely not bad for me. I also reasoned that I need to keep opening lines of attack towards his king, and therefore I went forward with f4, trusting it, but not fully knowing what the consequences were. I did also consider the response queen h5, whereupon I was planning, at the very least, knight h7, looking to play knight f6 in the future. But he didn't play queen h5, he played h4, threatening my knight. My first reaction here was that I must be winning now. The position around his king is just becoming too open. I thought I can start with f takes g3 check, but I noticed that after the recapture and the trades of rooks, and the retreat of my knight, his king is actually completely safe, and my attack has disappeared. I considered f3, and I calculated the line pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop, king takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and once again my attack has disappeared. My own kingside pawn structure is damaged, and I didn't like this at all. There was incidentally a winning sequence after f3 which I missed. It went f3, pawn takes knight, queen d7, and if the bishop moves away or captures the pawn, then queen h3 check, king g1, queen g3 check, taking advantage of the pinned f2 pawn, and winning the bishop, with mate to follow shortly thereafter. But again, I didn't quite see this, so I instead played the solid and still very good move, knight back to h7. From here, my knight can angle back through f6 and towards the newly weakened g4 square. Again, my position is very solid and with no weaknesses. A very harmonious position. Harmony that is reminiscent of the perfect fifth musical interval. Fitting for the fifth game of the tournament. I noticed at this stage that he could play knight e2, as mentioned earlier, attacking my bishop, and that I could then attack his rook and a pawn at the same time. I also noticed that with knight e2, his knight and bishop would be on a forkable square with my pawn. He didn't play knight e2 though, he played bishop e3. And here, with 14 minutes to play, I played the move queen d7. Now at this stage, the position is strange. It's strange because my only very active piece is my bishop on d4. My knight on h7 is not doing too much, and every other piece is still on the back rank, except the queen, but the queen is blocking my bishop. And yet, despite all this, there is perfect harmony between my pieces, and my pieces have the capability to operate from long ranges, and hence the fact that they're on the back rank doesn't matter. I have a massive threat in mind with this move, and that is the threat of queen h3 check. For instance, if knight e2, queen h3 check, forcing king g1, then I'd have pawn takes pawn, threatening mate on h2, which can only be stopped with knight takes pawn, then queen takes knight check, again using the pin on the f2 pawn, and now if the king moves away, I win the bishop, or if the bishop blocks the check, my other bishop swoops in, and mate is imminent once white gives up the queen. Therefore, white has to be extremely careful about this queen h3 check, and a move like knight e2 will clearly not suffice. If my opponent plays bishop g2, using this bishop to guard the h3 square, well then I can play f3, pushing that bishop away so I can proceed with my plan, or otherwise, if the bishop stays put, simply winning the bishop on the spot. With these variations no doubt in mind, my opponent played g4, blocking my queen's pathway to the h3 square, with a pawn that was defended by the bishop and the queen. That was what was good about the move. What was not so good about it is that it continued to open up his king, making his king ever more vulnerable. However, now the trouble was with my clock. I needed to be able to find the solutions on how to break through the remainder of his position, and I needed to do it quickly. I was down to 9 minutes at this stage. I played knight f6, putting more pressure on the g4 pawn, and improving the position of my knight. I realised that if he defends the pawn with the rook, I'd have bishop takes pawn hitting the rook, and when the rook moves, bishop takes pawn again, at which point I have the safer king, 2 extra pawns, an ongoing attack, and a great position all round. My opponent also realised that, and hence he played the only alternate move in order to defend the pawn. He played king h3. But this I had foreseen, and I had seen that with his king on h3, his g5 pawn is pinned, and I can build pressure on that pinned pawn by continuing with h5. Still keeping in mind that if he continues to defend by moving the rook, my dark squared bishop springs to life, which is what happens next. He saved his rook and simultaneously attacked my dark squared bishop. He was now playing very quickly, as he had been doing all throughout the game, and my clock was down to 6 minutes. And he was hoping to force enough complications that I'd either run out of time or make a mistake under time pressure. A very real possibility. But I stayed cool and calm and just thought through the position. I had a huge attack against g4 and his king behind that. I took the pawn with check, and when he captured back I took again, simultaneously defending my dark squared bishop. When he recaptured with his rook, I played queen e7, which is not the very best move in the position, but it's still a very strong move and one that I saw quickly. It retains a winning advantage by unleashing the bishop against the pinned rook, whilst also combining the dark squared bishop and the queen against the pawn on h4. Here he moved his king up and attacked my bishop, also unpinning his rook. And here, with 5 minutes remaining, I needed to think. If I take his rook, he captures back with his queen. I can then capture on h4, offering a queen trade and protecting my dark squared bishop. But can he hurt me there? What if he declines the queen trade? I noticed in this position that he would have queen e6 check, and if I move my king onto the h-file, he would then have rook h1, pinning my queen to my king. Therefore, maybe I can't take the rook. Or maybe after queen e6 check, I just have to play rook f7 to block the check, so that there will not be any alignment of my king and queen for his rook to take advantage of. I thought about it some more, wanting to be careful and not to throw away a good position, and knowing I really did need to be careful. I looked again at bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop, queen takes pawn, queen e6 check, king h7, rook h1, and then I saw the answer. f3 check. Forcing the king away from the rook and allowing queen takes rook check. Once I saw this, I knew I'd be okay. I took the rook, and when he recaptured, I took the pawn on h4, offering a queen trade, which, to my surprise, he accepted, and then played king f3. In this position, we both have dark squared bishops, we both have a rook, but I have a rook instead of his knight, and I have 2 extra pawns, and they are connected passed pawns to boot. So here, the position is great for me, and relatively safe, except for what is happening on the clock. I'm down to 3 minutes. I'd love to push g5, g4, g3, but clearly that's not possible yet. I'd need to get a rook behind the pawn, but that can't happen because my king is in the way. Besides, we're in an endgame now, and I want to activate my king. King h7 doesn't look any good because he can pin me with his rook. So here I played the best move, king f7. I had also considered c6, once again with the idea of restricting his knight, but ultimately I decided that moving the king was more important at this stage, and even if he does play knight d5, I'll be able to defend everything easily and then push his knight away once everything is consolidated. So after king f7, he played rook g1, tying my king to the defense of the g7 pawn. And here I decided to just push that pawn forward into the custody of my bishop, still ready to meet knight d5 with one of the rooks to c8. But here instead he played knight e2, perhaps hinting at playing d4 in the near future. I thought about king e6, but I didn't like that he could play d4 and then support it further with bishop c3, or otherwise push forward to d5, and maybe create some kind of an impenetrable fortress and escape with a draw somehow. Of course, with hindsight, there was nothing here to fear, but in time pressure, now down to 1 minute on my clock, I did not want to take any chances. So I played rook f to e1 to bring extra defense to the e5 pawn. He quickly played rook g4 and my priorities changed. I realized I would rather give extra defense to my bishop than to my pawn. And I also that my rook belonged on the h-file because from there it may penetrate into his position in the future. So I played rook h8. He followed up with knight g1, and now that knight d5 was clearly never going to happen, I just brought my king closer to the action and put the ball back in his court. On bishop c3, I realized I had everything perfectly well defended. I now just needed to take this chance to open the h-file for my rooks, so I played bishop g3, and he responded with knight e2. At this point, let me just point out that my opponent was a really good sport. See, I was late to this game, and I called ahead to let the director of play know that I was late. "No problem," he said, "but your clock may be running when you get here," which is completely fair enough. However, when I arrived at the venue and got to the playing table, I noticed that my opponent had deliberately not yet started my clock. He waited for me so that I would have a full quantity of time. And because of that, I was able to take that time and spend it coming up with all the moves we've seen till now. And yet, despite that gracious act of his, I was now down to less than 1 minute remaining on my clock. Luckily, with every move you make, your clock gains 30 seconds increment. So at this stage, I was essentially playing on the increment alone. And here, I had to think fast. I saw, of course, that he's threatening to take my bishop, and when I recapture with the pawn, he'll take that too. My first thought, however, was that I could play rook h4, securing a trade of rooks since his rook can't go anywhere. It might look like knight takes bishop, rook takes rook, king takes rook, pawn takes knight, king takes pawn. And that would be very good for me. My second thought was, how about rook h3, directly defending the bishop and preparing discovered attacks against the king? But then there'd be rook takes bishop, rook takes rook check, knight takes bishop, rook takes rook check, rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, king takes pawn, and the two variations have transposed into one another, and therefore this is also good for me. But then I had one more thought. How about bishop h2? That really restricts his knight. It threatens to play rook h3 check, followed by doubling my rooks on the h-file, and it doesn't give up any material at all. I looked back at my clock. 3 seconds left. I played bishop h2 and hit the clock. I saw that my clock had 1 second left by the time I moved the bishop and hit the clock. Another half a second later, and my clock would have run out and the game would have been over. But as played, I now had another 30 seconds, and as it happened, I had played the best move available. He played bishop d2, as reasonable as practically anything else, and again it was up to me to use my 30 seconds to come up with a move. What I came up with was almost immediate, rook h3 check. At the very least I can double my rooks on the next move, and now I have almost a minute to play with. After king g2, I spent half of my remaining minute calculating, and I came up with the move rook takes d3, allowing him to take my bishop, but then I take his bishop in return, also having won a pawn, and also pinning his knight. Therefore, after I took on d3, wanting to maintain complexity, he decided to retreat his bishop rather than taking mine. But seeking simplicity, I decided to play f3 check, forking his king and knight, guaranteeing that I would win the knight for my bishop, and pushing him into taking my bishop. I then played the intermediate move rook h8 check, and then took his knight with my pawn. I still have 1 minute on my clock at this point, but my position now is excellent and it's safe, and it's getting simpler with every move. He now played rook g2 attacking my pawn, and I considered rook e3 to defend, but I didn't like his potential to play bishop d3, followed by rook takes pawn and then bishop takes pawn check. If I had more time, I probably would have seen that after bishop d3, I could have played pawn promotes to queen with check. But again, in time pressure, I simply saw that that was complicated, whereas I had a much more simple option, which I played, and that was rook takes a3, allowing him to take on e2. Again, I had 1 minute, and I used it to play g4, the best move in the position, pushing a passed pawn, and also creating conditions that he can never rectify. You see, my a3 rook prevents his king from ever getting to the 4th rank, which it would have to do if it wanted to attack my pawn. Meanwhile, his bishop is of the wrong colour to join in on an attack against that pawn. So if he ever wants to prevent the advance of this pawn, he has to do so with his rook. And I can defend with my own rook. Then once he's tied down, I can use my other rook versus his bishop, as well as my pawn majority on the other side of the board, as well as my more active king, to create ever more unsolvable problems for him. So I played g4, he played rook f2 check, I simply moved aside, moving towards that side of the board where I thought I was going to create even more problems for him. He then attacked my pawn and I defended it as planned. And now, really struggling to find anything objectively good to do, my opponent played c5. But I just quickly played d5 so that after the captures, I would have yet another passed pawn, this time on e5. And meanwhile, his c and b pawns would be dominated by my a, b and c pawns. 1 minute in this position is more than I will need. He played bishop g3, and I considered briefly e4, but he can take on c7. So I also considered c6, but then he can play rook d2 check, which is still great for me, but more complicated. And then I saw it, the way to end resistance. Rook a1 check. Now, if he goes to the h-file, I check him on h8, which wins the bishop by force. And if he instead goes to f2, which he did, I retreat back to a2, again with check. And when he moves the king, I capture his remaining rook, simplifying matters further still. This is what happened, and it's why on move 47, he didn't bother to recapture my rook. He instead just put down his king and resigned the game. I have to say I was quite pleased with this game. It was difficult in that I had to find a way to break down his weaknesses, and that took lots of time to work out how to do. But I was happy because I did it quite successfully, and I maintained a smooth, steady growth of a strong advantage that gradually grew through the game and really never swung in his favour. I thanked my opponent again for his gracious move in letting me start with a full allotment of time, and we analysed some of the positions together after the game. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, comment and subscribe, share it with a friend, and come back next week for round 6 of the championship. Till then, take care of yourselves and others, and I'll see you soon.